As mentioned in the prior video of this retrospective, August 26th, 2017 was a huge day for the Yakuza franchise, with RGG Studio announcing 4 brand new titles all in one presentation. The first of these was Yakuza Kiwami 2, a full remake of Yakuza 2 for the PlayStation 2. And the second was a brand new title called Hokuto ga Gotoku, or Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise as it would become known in the West. This was a brand new Yakuza title, though you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise, as this was a Yakuza spin-off, licensing and leveraging the IP of one of the most popular manga of all time, Fist of the North Star, or Hokuto no Ken as it's known in Japan, hence the name Hokuto ga Gotoku. And they were very straight up about this being a Yakuza game when they first announced it, even announcing it with this awesome trailer of Kiryu doing some signature techniques from Fist of the North Star, and saying some of the main protagonist's catchphrases before shifting into him. Though, for whatever reason, the Western marketing campaign didn't focus on the Yakuza connection whatsoever, and just advertised the game as a new Fist of the North Star game. And luckily, I just so happen to be a pretty big Fist of the North Star fan, and I've developed a very deep appreciation for the Yakuza franchise throughout this retrospective. So, over the last few weeks, I sunk nearly 50 hours into a full playthrough of this game, and have come away with a ton of thoughts on it. So, does Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise manage to offer an experience that pleases both fans of the Yakuza games and fans of the original manga or anime? And most importantly, is it just a good video game? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 15th in a series of videos where I'm playing every single game in the Yakuza series for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. You don't have to have seen the other videos in order to enjoy this one, but you'd probably enjoy them if you're a big fan of the Yakuza franchise. So for those who are interested in checking out those either before or after watching this video, I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise is an action role-playing game developed by Ryuga Gotoku Studio and published by Sega exclusively for the PlayStation 4 in 2018. It is a spin-off of the Yakuza franchise, but it's also firmly set within the universe of Fist of the North Star, though it's not canon to the original manga or story. Rather than simply retell the story of the manga, which honestly would have been pretty awesome, RGG instead opted to create an original story within the Fist of the North Star universe that runs parallel to the manga. So, interestingly, the game picks up at the end of the Southern Cross arc of the manga and explores a fun sort of what-if scenario for fans. Characters, backstories, and general plot beats from the manga are present here, but they're all remixed and repurposed for the sake of telling a totally new alternate version of the manga's story. And while I'm sure a lot of Fist of the North Star fans weren't exactly thrilled by this decision, I honestly really enjoyed it. Like I said, it would have been awesome if they had just retold the story of the manga, but having a new original story that simply uses all the best elements of the manga in a new way allows for a story that's both more accessible for those not familiar with the source material, as well as offering something totally new for fans who are familiar with it. And placing the story at the very end of the Southern Cross arc was a really great decision, as that is quite literally the second arc of the manga. So those who might want to catch up a bit before playing Lost Paradise will only need to read about 10 chapters of the manga, or watch about the first 20 episodes of the anime to get there. That being said, a lot of characters and plot elements from later in the manga are used here, and you'll definitely appreciate these appearances more if you're someone who's already familiar with the source material. But the minimum amount of context needed to just pick up and play the game is, well, super minimal, which just makes it incredibly accessible to new fans from a story perspective. And for those not familiar with Fist of the North Star, the general premise here is that we follow a man named Kenshiro, a master of martial arts, and the current successor of the Hokuto Shinken style. an ancient martial art that focuses on channeling one's energy into a single precise blow to specific pressure points of the opponent's body, with the pressure from these precise blows then destroying said opponent from the inside out, often in a violent, gory explosion. The world of Fist of the North Star is a dead one, with a nuclear war having scorched the entire Earth and left it a barren wasteland, destroying modern civilization, the natural environment, and more than 80% of the human population. Think of the world of Fist of the North Star as a combination of something like Mad Max, with most of humanity reduced to small settlements struggling to get by, or groups of bandits stealing and killing as they please, with a few martial artists running around that feel straight out of an action shonen like Dragon Ball or JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The story of Lost Paradise itself sees our protagonist Kenshiro traveling to a city called Eden in search of his lost fiancée Yuria after his fight with Shin at the end of the Southern Cross arc. Eden is an original city to Lost Paradise, which is known as the City of Miracles due to how plentiful its resources like food and water are, how secure and safe it is for its civilians, and the fact that the ruler of the city is supposedly capable of granting any wish. Upon his arrival in Eden, Kenshiro finds that the city's walls are impenetrable, but after killing some bandits outside the gates while defending a child, the head of the city guard sees his martial arts and deems him too dangerous to let wander around, so Ken is thrown into Eden's prison. While in prison, we learn that Eden has a coliseum where the prisoners fight to the death while the citizens watch and bet on who will survive. But the prisoner who wins the entire tournament is able to have any wish of theirs granted by the ruler of the city. So of course, Ken ends up fighting in the Coliseum, reaching the end of the tournament only to learn that the whole thing was rigged against him, as they have a literal giant who they keep around as their champion to squash any would-be winners. But of course, Kenshiro is so powerful that he manages to defeat the giant and win the tournament anyway. He asks the city's ruler simply for the freedom to search the city for his fiancée, and his wish is granted, freeing him from the prison and making him an honorary citizen of Eden. Shortly after this though, Eden's front gate is blown open by a group of bandits known as the Army of Ruin, leaving the city open to attack from outsiders. So naturally, being the hero that he is, Kenshiro steps up to help the city in their time of need, despite having no real obligation to do so. As thanks for this, the ruler of Eden reveals to him that she actually knows not only who Yuria is, but also where she is. So from here, we get a solid mix of helping out the city guard and preventing the city from being overrun by bandits and criminals, as well as chasing down leads to try to find Yuria with some help from the leaders of Eden. And this largely makes up the rest of the main story. From here, you get all the crazy twists and betrayals and conspiracies that you would expect from a typical Yakuza story, except this time, set within the world of Fist of the North Star. And I have to say, the main story of Lost Paradise is surprisingly good. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that it's still wildly entertaining for even those who aren't familiar with the source material. Again, maybe not as entertaining, as characters like Devil Rebirth, who I just alluded to, as well as others from later in the manga, do make appearances here in ways that they never did in the original story. But that being said, it's probably still a damn good time, even if you're not familiar with who these characters are or what they actually go through in the original manga. And for those who are familiar with all of that, as long as you're able to get over the fact that this isn't just a retelling of the manga's story, it's really fun to see all of these iconic characters converge in or around Eden for all of their own personal reasons, and get this sort of what-if alternate timeline kind of scenario. But while we're on the topic of the story, I should definitely mention that this game actually has an English dub for the first time in the entire series since the Western release of Yakuza 1, which is awesome, except it's pretty terrible. And not in like the fun bad way where you're kind of laughing out loud at the game the whole way through like Yakuza 1, just painfully stiff and rigid deliveries pretty much across the board that almost make you cringe more than laugh. and the Japanese dub of the game sees the actors of the mainline Yakuza titles voicing iconic characters from the manga, like Kiryu's voice actor playing Kenshiro here, and the actors of characters like Goro Majima and Ryuji Goda playing a bunch of the antagonists. So I naturally decided to play through the whole thing in Japanese. I know that a lot of people just prefer to have the game spoken in a language that they can understand a lot of the time, but man, from the handful of scenes that I did go back and watch in English just to check it out and see how it was, it's really rough here. So I guess just know that if you are someone who prefers the English dub no matter what, you do have one. Just know that I would absolutely recommend that you go into the settings and switch it over to the Japanese dub before you actually start playing.
But don't think for 1 second that I'd let you walk away from this place alive.
I've come here to meet somebody in your prison. You going to let me in?
我々に盾ついた以上生きて帰れると思うなよ俺は中にいる男に会いに来ただけだ通してくれ
When the time comes, both Hokuto and Nanto will be nothing before the might of Keno!
ならばこの剣を最強の北斗とナントの究極両方とも飲み込んでくれる
Visually though, this game looks absolutely awesome. They've gone with the art style of the manga over that of the 80s anime adaptation, which was a fantastic decision because while the old anime adaptation looked good for what it was, the original art style of the series is just so much more timeless by comparison. They're also using some cell shading here to mimic the thick lines of the manga's original style, which really helps to make everything feel like it pops off the screen. And on top of that, there is some really nice use of color here. An issue that I've had with RGG's games for a while now is that they can never seem to get the colors in their games quite right, with things often feeling a little too dull or just straight up blown out. But Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise is colorful and vibrant in all the ways that you would expect an anime game to be, and the lighting and shading feels just right pretty much across the board. It leads to a game that looks very different from your typical Yakuza title, which you might expect given that it's based on an entirely different style, but it's different in a good way, and it's really awesome to see how they were able to pull off this entirely different look within the same engine that they've been using for the rest of the series for years at this point. And speaking of engine, that actually brings me to one of the most interesting things about Lost Paradise. That being that this game does not use the Dragon engine. Instead, Lost Paradise actually runs on the Yakuza 5 engine, with studio head Toshihiro Nagoshi explaining in an interview that this was because the team working on the project was almost entirely made up of newer developers that they had recently hired, and the older engine was significantly easier to work within. So they decided to use the Yakuza 5 engine for this game to allow those newer developers to become more familiar with their tools and workflow in a more streamlined environment. You'd think that this would feel like a downgrade compared to things like Yakuza 6 or Kiwami 2, but honestly, aside from having loading screens return in place of seamlessly walking in and out of interiors, it really doesn't feel like a downgrade in terms of the visuals or the gameplay. And before moving on from all the presentation talk, I do have to highlight that the soundtrack in this game is awesome. The music in RGG's games is normally pretty exceptional, but Lost Paradise's just really feels like something special even compared to the average Yakuza game. You have all sorts of different genres and kinds of music here that offer the perfect backing to things like long battles, boss fights, sub-stories, and even just the more atmospheric moments. There are quite a few standout tracks in this game, and all of them just bring the gameplay from something that would be pretty fun to something truly exceptional. Here, take a quick listen and judge for yourself. speaking of gameplay, we're about 10 minutes into the video now, so it's probably about time that we got to that. And of course, we'll start where we always do in these videos, the combat. Now, as far as the gameplay goes, the combat is probably where Lost Paradise has the least similarities with the mainline Yakuza franchise. That's not to say that there aren't similarities here, as you'll quickly realize that there are plenty, but this is probably the area of the game that deviates and attempts to do its own thing the most. Firstly, Kenshiro starts out incredibly powerful here, just like he does in the manga. For those who have never read or watched Fist of the North Star, in the literal first chapter/episode, Kenshiro is already an absolute master of Hokuto Shinken and is more than capable of blowing people up with the touch of his finger. And that is to say, this isn't a character who needs to be built up over the course of the game. He's done years and years of harsh training prior to the events of the game kicking off, and as soon as you get put in his shoes, you can feel it. That's not to say that he doesn't get stronger throughout the game, but let me just run you through what he's capable of right from the start. He has your basic light attacks and heavy attacks, and these work exactly like they do in any other Yakuza game. You press the square button for a light attack, and you can throw anywhere from 1 to 4 of these in a combo, and at any time during that combo, you can press triangle to throw in a finisher. And before explaining the functionality any further, can I just point out that these combat animations are absolutely awesome? I mean, seriously, compared to the more rough, street brawling styles that we're used to from the series, Ken's animations feel like an anime-as-fuck master of martial arts, and it just kicks so much ass. The way that enemies explode into blood and gore when defeated, just like in the manga, is also hilarious and only enhances that power fantasy even further. Some of these combos can also launch enemies into the air, and if you can time your inputs and use the correct combat tools and extensions, Lost Paradise now has legitimate juggle combos for the first time in the franchise. And they are unbelievably satisfying to pull off, especially when you manage to extend one by using your finisher to launch an enemy, only for them to bounce off of a wall and come back to you, and you're able to catch them with a new combo for a reset. As you use these standard combos though, you'll notice that this little skull icon on the enemy's health bars will fill up as you hit them. And once it's filled up entirely, it will change into a prompt to press the circle button. Doing so will allow Ken to strike one of the enemy's pressure points, putting them into a stun state that allows you to initiate something entirely new, Hokuto secret techniques. These are massive finishing moves that will deal so much damage that they're practically guaranteed to insta-kill any enemy, and each and every one of these over-the-top animations is pulled directly from the manga or the anime adaptation. These are essentially Kenshiro's equivalent of heat actions, except they're far more powerful in both how much raw damage they deal, as well as how easy they are to initiate. Instead of needing to slowly build up your heat gauge and then expend it to dish out this large amount of damage, you're pretty much able to initiate one with no cost to any of your resources every time you land 1 or 2 combos on an enemy. Each one of them will also have a QuickTime event prompt in the middle of the animation that, if hit correctly, will increase the damage dealt even further. And as you use certain secret techniques more and more throughout your playthrough, you'll actually be able to level them up, unlocking more of these QTE prompts and allowing for even higher damage output. Later in the game, you can also get an upgrade that restores 3% of your health bar every single time you use a secret technique, which makes you feel like an unkillable god of death when you're in the flow state of using these over-the-top executions on everyone and regaining your own health while doing so. These are an incredible bit of fan service for fans of Fist of the North Star, and an awesome way of adapting the Yakuza franchise's heat actions over to Kenshiro's fighting style. So, all around, I'm pretty positive on them. They do get pretty repetitive as the game goes on, as compared to your typical 5-second or so heat action animation, some of these get up to like 10 to 15 seconds long, but thankfully, you're never required to use them thanks to some alternatives existing, Like, for example, instead of just stunning the enemy and setting them up for a secret technique, you can instead press the circle button a second time during the animation, and if you time it perfectly, this will just instantly kill the enemy instead of setting them up for a big finisher. That being said though, thanks to both the damage output and especially the healing factor of these secret techniques, these are kind of just the best option available. So you will probably use them most of the time, even after you start to get sick of them. Now, all that might make it sound like there's no heat system here, but that's not the case. Kenshiro has a gauge up in the corner of the screen called the 7-star gauge, and this is his heat system. As you deal damage to enemies, this gauge will gradually fill, and once it's full, Ken will gain a passive blue aura. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that this is the return of a passive heat state after its absence from the last couple games, because unfortunately, it's not. All that having a full star gauge does is grant this aura. It doesn't offer any actual benefits to your combat, it's just a visual effect. However, if you press R2 while you have a full star gauge, you'll be able to enter burst mode, with Ken's shirt exploding off of him as his strength surges and his aura turns red. Yakuza fans probably already recognize this mechanic, because yes, this is the exact same as the extreme heat system seen in Yakuza 6 and Kiwami 2. While in burst mode, Ken will gain massively increased damage and defense, as well as gain access to a whole bunch of new attacks. And while I'm not a big fan of the extreme heat system, and I'm especially not a fan of not having a passive heat state, I actually think that this is the best version of this specific flavor of the Yakuza heat system that we've seen so far. Since the secret techniques take on the role of heat actions and don't actually require any of your star gauge to use, it makes it feel less like a heat gauge and more like an extreme heat gauge, as the only real purpose that it serves is to charge and enter burst mode. Additionally, on top of adding a whole bunch of new secret techniques that can't be used outside of burst mode, it also offers a bunch of new normal attacks that can be thrown out in place of your standard combos and other techniques, which makes burst mode feel less like you have to race to use your buffed up secret techniques before time runs out, and more just like a general buff state, since literally everything in your kit is being thoroughly enhanced here. Some of these are even new defensive techniques, like Ken's equivalent of the signature Tiger Drop actually being a burst mode exclusive, which while I'm not particularly huge on, it does give burst mode a more balanced playstyle that prevents it from falling into the same traps of prior extreme heat states. So like I said, I'm still not a huge fan of this particular heat mechanic, but this is easily the best take on it so far. Now, as I kind of mentioned already with that Tiger Drop comment, Kenshiro's defensive utilities are way weaker than what we've seen from prior protagonists in the Yakuza series. Even the simplest defensive utilities he has, like his quick-step attacks, are awful in this game, thanks to just how short his quick-step range is and how little damage they deal. The only quick-step attack really worth using is the one that you get when you quick-step towards an enemy, as this one launches them up into the air and sets them up for a juggle combo, which is actually really nice. But the other ones, from sidestepping or taking a step backwards, are unfortunately practically useless. As you train and level up though, you will gain some really cool defensive abilities, like one that allows Ken to enter a stance for only about a second that will automatically see him backflipping away from an enemy if they try to strike him while he's in said stance. This is somewhat like a parry mechanic given how tight the timing is, it looks awesome, and it burns your 7-star gauge when you use it. Yeah, this awesome defensive utility that you get later into the game that fits the character perfectly and makes you feel like an absolute badass when executed properly, yeah, you'll have to sacrifice your burst mode if you want to actually use it. And stuff like this unfortunately becomes a pattern across all of Ken's defensive kit, with things either being super useful on paper but bad in practice, actively burning resources that are better spent elsewhere, or just being locked behind burst mode itself. The one saving grace of his defensive tools is that with a lot of grinding through both leveling up and training through his master, which we'll come back to a bit later, Ken can unlock new secret techniques that can be activated from a block state right as an enemy attacks you, which allows him to counter basically every weapon type in the game. Whether you're up against an unarmed enemy, an enemy wielding a crossbow, or even an enemy with a flamethrower, you'll be able to unlock a secret technique that will turn the tables on that enemy's attack and kill them instead, pretty much no matter what they're using. Aside from these and the previously mentioned uppercut though, while Ken does have some okay defensive tools, the most optimal way to play him is usually just to deal a ton of damage and overwhelm the enemy with offense before they can do much damage to you. Something that really shocked me though was the enemy variety in this game. You have your standard enemies who are exactly what you'd expect from a Yakuza game, with these guys being enemies that are about the same height as Ken and come in variations of armed and unarmed. Then there's your slightly larger enemies that are a bit tougher to take down or stun, but generally are the same as just your basic enemies. And this is typically about where you'd expect the enemy variety to end in your average Yakuza game. But in Lost Paradise, you also have these hulking brutes that come with massive weapons, and these guys will block any combo that you try to hit them with after the second or third hit and counterattack as soon as your combo ends to punish you just for mashing buttons at them. So instead of throwing out your flashiest combos and pressing whatever buttons you really want like usual, you actually have to get yourself positioned behind them, as attacks from the back will stun them very quickly and open them up for a secret technique. Then there are these smaller enemies that will run around and leap at you from a distance when you least expect it, and much like the giant enemies, your standard combos don't work on them either, as all the attacks will just go right over their head. Your secret techniques also won't work on them, because they're so small that the animations wouldn't have been able to be reused for them, and the devs didn't have the time to reanimate all this game's various executions for them. However, you might notice that they always have the circle prompt on them, meaning that they don't actually have to be attacked before simply striking their channeling point. So instead, you'll just want to run up quickly and hit their channeling point before they run away and get that perfect timing kill that I mentioned before. And in the event that any of these tactics don't interest you, like I mentioned earlier, there are some defensive secret techniques that you can unlock for every single enemy type in the game. So you can always just wait for them to attack you first and simply counterattack with a stylish execution. Point being though, I was very pleasantly surprised by the enemy variety on offer here, and I absolutely loved how it made me approach every enemy in a different way rather than just using all the same tools over and over again like I normally do in a Yakuza game. And overall, I think that the combat in Lost Paradise is a lot of fun, though it definitely gets repetitive and doesn't feel like it has the depth or longevity of some of the best combat systems from the Yakuza franchise. That being said though, I don't think that was necessarily the goal. I mean, of course the developers would have loved to have one of the best combat systems in the series, but I think that the reason it doesn't is because of all the experimental changes to the core mechanics that this game makes, and I think it's important to look at why those changes were made. The combat of Lost Paradise still aims to make a fun Yakuza combat system, hence why it still uses a lot of the core mechanics of the series. But at the same time, the most important thing with this title was to make it feel like you're playing as Kenshiro and make a combat system that would appeal to fans of the Fist of the North Star franchise first and foremost. And with that main goal in mind, I think it does a really good job. I mean, sure, it still got pretty repetitive for me once I had played a good 20 to 30 hours of the game, but at the same time, I was having a blast playing as Ken and mashing the square button on my controller into oblivion every time I executed a 100-fist rush. The presentation, the mechanical changes, the sound design, and the voice acting all perfectly sell the experience of playing as the true successor of Hokuto Shinken. And while it might not be as mechanically polished as other entries in the series, I still had an absolute blast with it as a fan of both the Yakuza and the Fist of the North Star franchises, so I'd say mission accomplished. With the combat covered though, let's move into the other half of a Yakuza title's gameplay, the open world and the side activities. Like I mentioned before, this game largely takes place in the city of Eden, but the world of Lost Paradise is much bigger than just one city district. This is actually the largest open world out of the entire franchise so far in terms of its literal size, and I'd be willing to bet that it will probably stay that way for a very long time. This is because you actually get your hands on a buggy about halfway into the game, and you're able to freely go and drive around the wasteland as well. This wasteland acts like a sort of overworld map that you can drive around, going around and picking up bits of scraps and parts that are used for various other aspects of the progression, or drive around to other locations outside of Eden that range from small camp settlements all the way to the prison Cassandra from the manga. Using the buggy to travel around does burn through your fuel though, and fuel costs a pretty decent amount of money, so you'll have to be mindful with your trips throughout the wasteland to prevent yourself from being stranded out there, as running out of fuel will simply load you back to your last autosave with anything you did while out on that excursion being lost. A lesson that I learned the hard way pretty early on in my playthrough. You can make your buggy more fuel efficient as your playthrough goes on, or just generally upgrade it in a plethora of ways, as the buggy is actually fully customizable. As you complete certain activities throughout the world, you might get a new buggy part as a reward, but you'll quickly notice that all of these parts you'll be collecting are just unusable junk. However, one of Ken's closest allies from the manga, Bat, appears in this game, and if you bring him those pieces of junk alongside the appropriate materials that you can gather from the wasteland to fix them, you'll be able to repair these parts and have Bat fit them to the buggy for you. That being said though, since the materials you find around the wasteland are completely random, you're much better off just going around to the local shops and buying up the supplies that you need. So tuning up your buggy can get pretty expensive, but it can also be super worthwhile if you spend a lot of time venturing into the wasteland. And a really cool touch here is that as you venture out into the wasteland, other camps and settlements will obviously not use the standardized currency that Eden does, so they won't take your money. Instead, if you want to buy things from these other settlements, you'll have to trade with the vendors instead. And yes, I really do mean trade with them. You'll quite literally have to offer up certain items of your own in order to try to get them to agree to trade you for the item that you want from them, which just really helps to sell that post-apocalyptic feel and remind players that this is a world that has been plunged into complete chaos. You'll also be able to find treasure maps while playing, with these largely dropping from random encounters. And when you get one, you'll be able to go out to a marked location in the wasteland to find whatever rare item is held within it. These can be pretty fun at first, but as you sink more time into the game, these treasure maps become incredibly annoying, and this is almost entirely because they're timed. Each treasure map that you find will have a time limit associated with it depending on the rarity of the actual treasure, with higher rarity treasures having shorter time limits and forcing you to race to them as quickly as you can. And since these just randomly drop from random encounters, you'll find yourself getting these unexpectedly while doing literally anything else in the open world. And because they have that time limit on them, you pretty much just have to drop whatever it is you might be doing whenever one of them pops up, as if you don't, you'll lose your chance to get some of the rarest and most valuable materials in the entire game. I get what they were going for with trying to make these feel like urgent, exciting hunts for hidden treasures scattered throughout the wasteland, but honestly, just not having a timer on them would have helped a lot with making them feel more fun, as it would prevent these from just entirely halting whatever else I'm trying to work on when they randomly pop up, and allow me to still go find those rare materials the exact same way once I'm done with whatever it is I'm doing. And just a small complaint with the wasteland in general, but you actually can't place a custom waypoint or marker or anything like that to drive towards on the map, so navigating it can kind of be a pain. I get that the Yakuza titles have never really needed a custom waypoint feature due to how small and intimate their open worlds usually are, but when you're driving across an expansive, desolate wasteland, trying to go to a very specific spot for hidden treasure, it would be really nice to be able to place a waypoint that appears on your minimap, instead of just needing to constantly open and close the full map to figure out where you're going. And as cool as all of the wasteland stuff is, it is worth emphasizing again that you don't get the buggy until roughly halfway into the main story, and that's actually just more of a general quirk with Lost Paradise, as really the entirety of the open world is locked off until nearly halfway through the story. This makes the pacing feel pretty wonky in Lost Paradise if you're the kind of person who actually engages with the side content, which is something that we will definitely be coming back to in a bit. But once you get here, all the usual things that you'd expect from a Yakuza open world are here. For example, you have an awesome selection of minigames, except this time, they're almost all either original or repurposed games that fit the world of Fist of the North Star. So you have your usual suspects like the casino games or the Colosseum, and these two in particular are pretty much unchanged. Although it is worth mentioning that the Colosseum now comes in two flavors, with one of them being that you just fight waves of generic enemies of varying difficulties, and the other actually allowing you to fight reskinned versions of the main story bosses again, but with them being scaled up to match your current level and giving special rewards for beating the buffed up versions. On top of these though, you have things like death batting. This is a spin on the classic batting cage minigame that's been with the Yakuza series since the original entry on PS2, but here, it's been changed from a simple batting cage into Ken swinging a giant piece of metal at bandits on their motorcycles to prevent them from storming into Eden, all while you've got some awesome hair metal blasting in your ears. You also have things like buggy racing, which, as you might expect, allows you to race other drivers in your customized buggy. This one is actually shockingly similar to the Pocket Circuit minigame from Yakuza 0 and Kiwami, but on top of customizing your vehicle, you now also actually get to drive it in the race yourself, which is a lot of fun. You can also collect these points called buggy points while on the track, and these buggy points can be spent to purchase unique goods that you can't purchase anywhere else in the game from the BP shop, a brand new shop that opens up alongside this minigame, which also ties the buggy races into your core progression should you decide to participate in them. And last but certainly not least, there's Dr. Ken. The local clinic has been short-staffed recently, and coincidentally, has also been having a bit of a problem with bandits coming through and demanding medicines so that they can sell it off to someone else for a higher price. So of course, Ken is called in to help out, with his Hokuto Shinken making him adept at both healing those in need and dishing out the pain to those who deserve it. In terms of actually playing the game though, this is a rhythm game that plays very similar to the mainline title's karaoke, just in the form of a hospital rave instead. No, I'm dead serious. Most of the music that backs this game is electronic, and once you get going, the party lights come on in the clinic for optimal musical therapy. At least, that's what the clinic staff say it's all for. There are quite a few great side stories on offer here as well, which, for those not familiar with the Yakuza franchise, just means a sort of minigame that also has a full progression system of its own and a string of side quests attached to said progression. The first of these is super straightforward, this being bounty hunting. As you might expect, this just involves the city guard paying out large bounties for Ken to go around and handle their most dangerous criminals for them. There's not a whole lot to it, but it's a fun way to make some money, and some of the later sub-stories attached to it get fairly entertaining, so it's a solid addition here. Then there's my personal favorite minigame in all of Lost Paradise, Bartender Ken. In this side story, the local bartender suffers an arm injury and can no longer tend to the bar and make drinks for his customers. So, of course, he talks Kenshiro into helping him out with the drink mixing for the time being because, as he puts it, good drinks can only be made by men with a strong spirit, and Ken fits that criteria perfectly. So, to actually do this, you get a series of little mini-games that see players stirring a drink by spinning their thumbstick, or shaking the controller like a shaker bottle to make delicious drinks for the customers. And this one is actually pretty cool, because every time you make a drink for someone, you'll learn a little bit about them and their life story. And eventually, nearly every regular customer who stops by the bar has their own sub-story that sees Ken helping them out with the difficult things going on in their private lives. Some of these customers are also shopkeepers from around town, and as your relationship with these customers grows, they'll add new items to their shop's inventory, allowing you to buy even better items and materials from them, just as long as you make them a few drinks here and there. And of course, working the bar will earn you a bit of cash on the side as well, and as you continue your bartending journey and improve Ken's bartending skill, you'll start to get paid more and more, which actually makes bartending one of the best ways to make money in the entire game, as once you raise that skill high enough, you can make roughly $7,000 per drink, which is just insane. So yeah, this was absolutely my favorite side story in Fist of the North Star, due to both the insane amount of charm that it has, as well as how helpful it actually is to your progression through the game. But that's not to say that the rest of the side stories are any less interesting. Next up, we have Manager Ken. This is essentially the Hostess Club side story from Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 2, with Ken finding himself $100 million in debt after breaking a one-of-a-kind piece of art, and picking up a job managing the floor at the local nightclub to make the money to pay it off. But instead of just reusing the minigame straight up like Kiwami 2 did, there are actually a lot of changes to it here in Lost Paradise. It still has the same basic gameplay loop, with Ken needing to manage the hostesses at the club and make sure that the customers leave happy by assigning a hostess to them that will meet their preference, making sure that the hostesses are properly cared for so that they can be at their best throughout the entire shift, and manage all the other things like hiring new hostesses or training the existing ones. But here in Lost Paradise, this minigame now has a way higher learning curve and requires much more strategy, which makes it a lot harder to manage, but way more engaging once you've wrapped your head around it. To start, you can now only have 6 hostesses on a shift instead of 8 like before, which means that you not only have less slots to fit in all the different types of hostesses, but also means that those hostesses will be under more stress throughout the shift compared to before, as each of the 6 will have to be out on the floor more often now. Each hostess now also strictly fits into one category, rather than having a little bit of everything and simply being better at one thing than the others. So if you don't have the correct type of hostess available for a certain customer, you're just screwed. Guests are pickier here as well, but you can now seat 2 girls at a table instead of just 1, meaning that you can try to make up for not having the perfect type by maybe having 2 of a different type that the customer only likes instead of loves. And here comes the real tricky part, the game in general just moves significantly faster here. When a new customer walks in, you'll have exactly 5 seconds to identify their preferences and assign a hostess to them before they get impatient and start making a scene. So you have to be super quick here to prevent any issues. But there is a solid way to deal with this. See, you can't simply view a guest's preferences at a glance anymore like before, but each guest has a distinct character portrait, and guests with the same portrait will always have the same preferences. So as you play the minigame more and more, you'll learn to identify guest portraits at a glance and immediately know whether they prefer a cute hostess, a sexy hostess, you get the idea. And the part that's easily the most Fist of the North Star about this is that when trouble does arise in your club, you now have to choose from different skills to resolve the conflict. And you can only choose from a handful of these skills to have on hand before starting the shift. So you have to properly prepare for potential issues ahead of time now. Normal civilians can be easily calmed down with a simple apology or discount, but bandits and ruffians will require a more hands-on approach, which of course sees Ken whipping out the Hokuto Shinken to get rid of them quickly. So overall, Manager Ken is another great side story that pulls directly from legacy Yakuza content, but manages to evolve its mechanics quite a bit and add a Fist of the North Star twist to it. So I'm a pretty big fan of this one too. And last, but, well, probably actually least this time, we have Merchant Ken. In this one, we learn that Lin, another iconic character from the manga, is not only in Eden, but has gotten a job with a local delivery service in order to make money and acquire goods that she'll need to help out her village. And of course, Ken ends up helping her out a bit. This is definitely the simplest side story aside from the bounty hunting, with players simply being able to stop by and check on Lin at her job, see what she needs for her deliveries, and go around to other local shops to pull those goods together for her, which her boss will then pay you back for after that delivery has been made. The pay for this is incredibly minimal, and especially since you'll be paying other merchants around town for anything that you don't already have on hand, you unfortunately won't make much money at all from this one, even by the time that you've totally maxed it out. There is a string of sub-stories attached to this with Lin and Bat, but honestly, even as a big fan of the source material, these sub-stories are fairly uninteresting. So, aside from this one awesome animation that you get when you complete an emergency order for Lin, I'm not really a big fan of this one. Overall though, the minigames and the side stories of Lost Paradise are pretty awesome. Not every single one of them was a hit for me, but I really do respect that even for the stuff that they pulled straight out of the mainline Yakuza titles, they put in the effort to change up the mechanics and theming of each minigame to make it feel like it fits within the world of Fist of the North Star. It makes even the reused content feel very fresh this time around. And as a fan of both series, I would say that that extra effort definitely paid off here. And thankfully, the sub-stories are really good this time around too. There are about 80 of them to be found in this game, including the ones from the side stories, and most of them are not only super entertaining, but also tie into some of the core themes from the manga, which, again, is just awesome for fans of Fist of the North Star. So, all things considered, Lost Paradise has some pretty awesome side content. Like I said, not everything is a hit, with things like Merchant Ken feeling pretty underwhelming and not very worthwhile, and not everything is perfect, with the Wasteland in particular being fairly flawed. But nearly everything here is well designed, and most importantly, fun to engage with. Now, while I would typically talk about the progression systems mixed in with the open world stuff in these videos, as the two kind of go hand in hand in this series, with Lost Paradise, I had so much to say about just the progression systems themselves that I had to put the majority of them into their own section. And fair warning, we might be entering rant territory here. First and foremost, you may have noticed from my footage already, but Lost Paradise actually uses a more traditional RPG leveling system, which is obviously very different from what the Yakuza series typically does, as they usually just have XP or skill points or whatever it might be in each specific game simply unlock new skills and abilities rather than just buffing all your stats across the board. So, in Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, it's a lot more straightforward than what you might be used to. If an enemy is a higher level than you, you're gonna have a tough time putting them down. But if you're a higher level than them, it's going to be super easy to deal with them. That's not to say that there isn't a skill point system, because there is, and it's actually very similar to the skill point system that we saw in Ishin. Every time you level up, you'll get one white skill point called a Star Orb, and this is a generic skill point that can be spent almost anywhere on the game's respective skill trees. But beyond that, there are also 3 differently colored skill points, which are green, orange, and blue, with each of these being skill points that can only be spent in their respective skill tree. So the green skill points specifically unlock new things from the skill tree, the orange points specifically unlock things from the body tree, and the blue points specifically unlock things from the mind tree. This is pretty much exactly what we saw with Ishin's skill points, but there's another slight twist here. That being that the colored orbs can't simply just unlock any skill within their respective tree. Instead, they can now only unlock these specific nodes on the tree that share the same color. So in order to progress any of the individual skill trees in this game, you'll have to use a combination of the generic skill points, the colored skill points that match that skill tree's color, and another new skill point type called the Shining Orb. The Shining Orbs are used to unlock these nodes with a bright yellow outline, and there are exactly 4 of these nodes on each individual skill tree. The catch is, though, Shining Orbs are unlocked by completing story chapters. So every time you complete a chapter of the main story, you will be rewarded with exactly 1 Shining Orb, meaning these specific nodes on the skill trees are also gated behind main story progression, which I don't necessarily have an issue with. If the developers want to make sure that they can prevent you from becoming too overpowered for the main story during your first playthrough, that's perfectly fine. But what I do have an issue with is that this game only has 12 story chapters, and the first and final chapter will not actually reward you with a Shining Orb. So you can only actually get 10 Shining Orbs per playthrough. And you may have caught on to the issue here already, but as there are 4 skill trees in this game, each with 4 of these nodes, there are 16 skill tree nodes that require the Shining Orbs, meaning that if you actually want to get all of the upgrades and new abilities here in Lost Paradise, you are required to go through nearly a full second playthrough in New Game Plus in order to do so. Now, that might not sound so bad to some, but let me also put it into the context of just how unbelievably grindy this game actually is. You'll have to spend a ton of time out in the open world grinding out side activities, and in my experience at least, also just grinding out random encounters in the wasteland on top of that for XP. Now, you could of course just not spend tens of hours at a time grinding open world content to try to get all the upgrades, but I always try to get at least close to unlocking every upgrade in these games, so that I can experience the full depth of the combat and develop a well-informed opinion on it for these videos. Hence why I felt compelled to spend so much time just grinding here in Lost Paradise, as well as why I was fairly upset that nearly half of the upgrades in the game would be locked behind just doing a full second playthrough full of a similar amount of grinding. And due to this game using a more traditional leveling system, should you choose to go out of your way and spend all those hours working towards seeing all the awesome abilities on offer, you'll be repaid by being so over-leveled that it becomes difficult to even enjoy the awesome long battles and boss fights of the main story. Seriously, after I spent a ton of time pulling together all the abilities that I could by, I think it was chapter 6 in the main story, I found myself defeating main story bosses in only 1 or 2 combos due to just how much damage I was dealing to them. This could have easily been solved by simply having enemy levels in the main story content scale relative to the players, or at the very least, having an optional setting for that. But for whatever reason, RGG opted to just let you become so powerful through the side content that not even the late game bosses can come close to defeating you. And because of this, after I had grinded a good bit in the middle of the story, I actually decided to stop spending time on the side content for the rest of my playthrough, just so that I wouldn't entirely ruin the remainder of the main story content for myself. So, unfortunately, I wasn't really able to dig as deep into the side content or the combat abilities as I would have liked during my run of this game. But at the very least, because I told myself to stop once I realized how much of a problem this was, I managed to only be about 7 levels above the final boss by the time that I got there. So I was still very overpowered by comparison, but at least I didn't just one-shot him because I had continued to progress to that same level. Something that only really compounds with these issues is that the pacing in this game is pretty awful, with nearly everything in the game feeling needlessly padded out. Aside from the sheer grind, at least a dozen of this game's sub-stories are actually part of the main story progression, meaning that story progression is regularly just halted until you complete a mandatory sub-story that's been thrown into the middle of the chapter. This sometimes even happens multiple times per story chapter, with a couple of chapters in particular having 3 sub-story interruptions within the span of 1 or 2 hours of gameplay. Some of the main story content itself is a bit silly as well, with some of it just being completely unnecessary padding. For example, there is an entire chapter of the story here that just pauses the main storyline for the sake of throwing in a character from the manga and dedicating the entire chapter to him. It's not a bad chapter, in fact, the encounter with said character was wildly entertaining, but it just feels really weird because, again, the main plotline is just randomly halted for the sake of this random side plot. There's a whole lot of this stuff, even just in the main story itself here, and while I still really enjoyed the main story overall, this is just one of those things that continues to wear on you and become more and more annoying each time that you notice it's happening. And finally, we have an entirely new progression system that's been added to Lost Paradise, that being the Destiny Talismans. Now, these are a really cool idea, with the player unlocking new Destiny Talismans throughout the story, and the concept behind these being that the people that Kenshiro meets throughout his journey each have their own personal impact on his overall destiny. Gameplay-wise, these talismans can be crafted with rare materials and some cash over at the talisman shop in Eden, and then you can equip up to 4 of them at a time, with each talisman that you equip being set to its own button on the D-pad. You can then press that button during gameplay to trigger the talisman, with each one having its own unique effect and a very long cooldown after use. Some of them are really good, like Uria's talisman allowing you to instantly enter burst mode regardless of how full your 7-star gauge is, or Lin's talisman automatically reviving you with a little bit of health whenever you die. But a lot of them are just not very exciting. For the most part, the Destiny Talismans offer some sort of marginal benefit that only lasts for a few seconds, like slightly increasing how fast your star gauge fills, or slightly increasing your defense. They also take a ton of effort and money to upgrade, as the materials that you use to upgrade them are almost entirely incredibly rare, and for the most part, only found in treasure chests. And as if that wasn't enough, the talisman shop owner charges a serious premium to actually do the work on them for you. So for the most part, I didn't really engage with this system all that deeply, as it kind of just felt like it was more effort than it was worth the majority of the time. But I will admit, for those couple talismans that seemed really good and I did go out of my way to acquire and upgrade them, they were well worth the effort. So over the course of something like a 100% playthrough, this system probably shines a lot better. It's a really cool idea for a new progression system that rewards you for both progressing the main story and exploring the open world, but I unfortunately didn't get a whole lot of mileage from it during my playthrough. Overall though, I enjoyed my time with Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise. It's not a perfect experience, far from it in fact, as it might be one of the most heavily flawed titles that I've covered in the series so far, but the thing that I just keep coming back to is that this game is a blast to play in spite of all that. Like, yeah, when I sit here and pick apart all the individual elements of the game's design, there are a lot of things that fall flat, but when I'm actually playing the game, it's just fun. I'm sure that a big part of that is that I'm a big fan of both the Yakuza and the Fist of the North Star franchises, but even if you were only a fan of one or the other, I bet you'd still have a really good time with this one. Its combat has issues, but it's so over the top and wonderfully presented that it's hard not to have a smile on your face the whole time. The open world may be incredibly grindy, but all of the individual activities are really fun to engage with. And the main story may be pretty poorly paced, but when it's at its best, it plays out like one of the most entertaining action shonens that you'll ever see. If you're a fan of either the Yakuza or the Fist of the North Star series, you'll definitely find plenty to enjoy here. And I'd be willing to bet that this game would be talked about a lot more across both fandoms if Sega were ever to free it from its PS4 prison. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise a 7.5 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Yakuza videos if you haven't already, or if you're looking to branch out a bit, maybe check out the series that we just finished up, where I played and reviewed every single game in the Resident Evil franchise. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our channel members and patrons who make series like this one actually possible. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment to help me out with the algorithm, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.